Okay, so today we learned some of the benchmark percents and how to use them to find percent of a value. We're going to look at a couple of other mental methods for finding percents. This worksheet is mental math percents. First, the 10% method. Okay, if you read through the notes, basically 10%. 10% is 1/10, which is 1 divided by 10. If you divide the number by 10, you get the percentage. Okay, or basically you're moving the decimal point one space to the left. So 10% of 400, move it one space to the left, is 40. 10% of 59, move the decimal point one space to the left, it gives you 5 9/10. 10% of 8 9600, move it one space to the left, you get 896 thousandths. Very simple. Okay, using 10, we can also find other things like 20%. Or 5%. 5 is half of 10. We already talked about that with the benchmark percents. 1%, which is 10% of 10%. Dividing 10% by 10, you get 1. Or in other words, you move the decimal point 2 spaces. So 20%, if 10% of 40 is 4, then 20% of 40 is 8. If 10% of 25 is 2 5/10, which it is, then 30% will be 7 5/10. 90%. A couple ways to do this one. 100% of 80 is 80. 10% of 80 is 8. And if you subtract them, you get 90% of 80 is 72. You could also do the 10% of 80 is 8 and multiply times 9 and you get 90% of 80 is 72. Both ways will work. For 5%, 5 is half of 10, so if 10% of 120 is 12, 5% is going to be 6. 10% of 30 is 3, then 5% is 1 5/10. 5% of 24, 10% of 24 is 2 4/10. 5% is going to be 1 2/10. We're doing 1%. Well, easy way to think of 1% is it's divided by 100. Move it over 2 decimal places. So 1% of 200 is 2. 1% of 680 is 6 8/10. Move it over 2 decimal places. 1% of 37 is 37 hundredths. Move it over 2 decimal places. Okay, those are really the 10% and the 1% is another method that we'll look at that can be used to find anything. Because if you can find the 10 and the 1, you can just use combinations of 10s and 1s or multiples of 10s and multiples of 1s to find the percents. Okay. Some of the other ones, they're like the benchmark fractions. We've talked about 50%. 50 is half. 25% is a fourth, or you can also think of it as half and half again, or half of a half. 33 1/3%. 33 1/3 is 1/3. That one's one you should know. So all we're doing is finding a third of the number or dividing it by 3. Okay. So, and then of course the 100%. 100% of anything is the anything. So 50% of 70, half of 70 is 35. 50% of 64, half of 64 is 32. 25% of 48 is a fourth of 48 is 12. Divide 48 by 12, or half of 48 is 24, half of 24 is 12. 25% of 10, so it's a fourth of 10. 50% of 10 is 5, half of that is going to be 2 5/10. 33 1/3, a third of 48. 3 goes into 48 16 times. 3 goes into 4 once, leaves 1 18. 3 goes into 18 6 times. A third of 25. 1/3 of 25 is, or excuse me, 1/3 of 75 is 25. Then 100% of 49 is 49. 100% of 3 is 3. We talked about those with benchmark percents. You look on the back. So similar to what we did with the benchmark percents, you can put other percents together to find what you're looking at, either adding or subtracting. For example, 5, if you need 6%, 5% and 1% is 6. You can do 9 is 10 minus 1. You can also think of it as 5 plus 4 ones. Okay. You can multiply. If you need 7%, 1 times 7. Okay, well, I said we can do with 10%, 1%. So to find 3%, a couple of ways you could do it. 3 times 1%, or you can do 1% plus 1% plus 1%. You could also do 5 minus 1 minus 1. 200%, well, that's simply 2 times 100%. That's going to be the easiest way to get it. 99%, if you do 100% minus 1%, that's 99%. 51%, if you do 50%, which is half of 100%, plus 1%, which is a 100th of 100%. It's very simple. So 2% of 800. Well, since 1% of 800 is 8, 2% of 800 will be 16. Write this under here. 100% of 7 is 7, so 4 times that much is going to be 28. So we get 400% of 7 is 28. 75% of 12. 25% of 12, you divide by 4 is 3. Multiply that times 3, and we get 75% of 12 is 9. So it's 9. 15%, if we do 10% of 30 is 3, and 5% of 30 is 1 5/10, then 15 is 5 plus 10 is going to be 4 5/10. 101% of 500, 100% of 500 is 500, and 1% of 500 is 5, so we get 505. 66 2/3 is 2/3 of 12. Well, 1/3 of 12 is 4, so 2/3 is going to be 8. So 66 2/3% of 12 is 8. Okay, the next part, this is one of those little tricks in math that's very useful. Okay, especially when we're doing percents. It sometimes makes the problem a lot easier to do. Okay, it's the commutative property. Commutative property means it doesn't matter what order they're in when you multiply. A times B equals B times A. You can commute them, you can move them around and still have the same answer. That also works with percents. So things like 20% of 100 is the same as 100% of 20. They both equal 20. Just 100% of 20 is easier to do. 70% of 10, 10% of 70 is an easier problem. 10% of 70 is 7. 20% of 50 or 50% of 20. Okay, 50% of 20 is easier to figure out if it's 10. Okay, so looking at 28% of 25, kind of a hard problem. We can figure out 25% of 25 and then figure out 3% of 25 and add them together, or just switch it up and make it 25% of 28, or 1/4 of 28 is going to be easier to figure out. So on these four, we're going to switch them first. So 48% of 50 can be rewritten as 50% of 48, which means half of 48, which is 24. 12% of 75, we can change that to 75% of 12, And since 25% of 12 is 3, and we also did that in a previous problem, 75% of 12 is 9. We already did that one up here. 16% of 200 is the same as 200% of 16, which is 16 times 2, which is 32. 72% of 10 is the same as 10% of 72, which is 7 2/10. Okay. So again, not quite as much writing on these problems as we did with the benchmark percents, but they are very useful techniques when you're doing mental math to solve percent problems.